skip over. That there are things that we're going to read in the Bible that we read that and it kind of takes you back and you think, how do I reconcile that kind of information? We'll be going through a couple over that, and the very end of Leviticus, I don't want to spoil the ending, is really important to look at. So in this whole book, why did God give all of these laws? Does it seems really legalistic to just say, all right, here's this list of laws, right? So our perspective, there's two different ways that we can look at the book of Leviticus, and that is from the perspective of the people who were originally hearing it, and from our perspective, people who have all this extra stuff, the New Testament, Jesus, and all this sort of stuff that helps us see what God was doing in that book. So we'll sort of bounce back and forth between the two. But were we ever supposed to actually be able to perfectly follow those laws? Was Israel ever supposed to actually be able to follow those laws and make sacrifices every time that they broke a law and do all of this stuff? Was that ever what God intended? Well, let's look at Hebrews 10, 1 through 10. And so Paul, we see this book in Hebrews where he's talking to all these Jewish people, and he's saying, here is everything in the what we call the Old Testament that shows what Jesus was supposed to be here for and who Jesus was, and you guys missed it. But here I'm going to tell you exactly where. So we see, for the law, since it has only a shadow of the good things to come, and not the very form of things, can never be, by the same sacrifices which they offer continually year by year, make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise would they not have ceased to be offered? Because the worshippers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have had consciousness of sins. But in those sacrifices there is a reminder of sins year by year, for it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Therefore, when he comes into the world, he says, sacrifice and offering you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. In whole burnt offerings and sacrifices, for sin you have taken no pleasure. Then I said, behold, I have come. In the scroll of the book it is written of me, to do your will, O God. After saying above, sacrifices and offerings and whole burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin you have not desired, nor have you taken pleasure in them, which are offered according to the law. Then he said, behold, I have come to do your will. He takes away the first in order to establish the second. By this will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. So we see that as we're looking back at the book of Leviticus, that it was always intended. God had intended from the very start for it to be something that you read all these laws, and Israel would look at all this stuff and they'd say, man, that something in there happens to me every single day of my life. There is always something. I'm always touching something that's dead, or I didn't know that something was dead and I touched it, or something every single day was supposed to point all of them to, I can't do this. There has got to be something other than me because I cannot keep this law. Something every single day I am doing breaks this law. And that was supposed to point them to, there has to be something outside of me that can take this away. So then, also, what about the priests? There's a lot of sections in Leviticus about what are priests supposed to do. How are they supposed to represent God and represent the people to God? What happens? Why was that important? So we look in Hebrews 9. We see, now when these things have been so prepared, the priests are continually entering the outer tabernacle, performing the divine worship. But into the second, only the high priest enters once a year, not without taking blood, which he offers for himself and for the sins of the people committed in ignorance. The Holy Spirit is signifying this, that the way into the holy place has not yet been disclosed while the outer tabernacle is still standing, which is a symbol for the present time. Accordingly, both gifts and sacrifices are offered which cannot make the worshiper perfect in conscience, since they relate only to food and drink and various washings, regulations for the body imposed until a time of reformation. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things to come, he entered through the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this creation, and not through the blood of goats and calves, but through his own blood. He entered the holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkling those who have been defiled sanctify for the cleansing of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? For this reason, he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that since a death has taken place for the redemption of the transgressions that were committed under the first covenant, those who have been called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. For where a covenant is, there must of necessity be the death of the one who made it. So we see that even the priests, who were supposed to be the prime example of how to live and all this stuff, their own life was never intended to look perfect either, because their presence was a symbol of what Jesus was going to do and who Jesus was going to be. All of this is supposed to remind us as people who look back at this time in Leviticus, and the people who were reading that originally and having those laws on them, was always supposed to be a reminder that we can't be perfect and we are not holy, and we have to have something that goes in our place to be holy. So that video did cover what holiness is, but as we go into the last 3 chapters, there's a couple other terms that I think we need to make sure that we're sure on. Holy means set apart. So people oftentimes, when we say somebody is holy or something is holy now, we think of very moral, is kind of how we would define holy a lot of times now. But that is different than what the Bible would define as holy. Holy means set apart. Holy just means dedicated to God, essentially, that you are serving God, and that is what you're dedicated to. The other things, redeem means that something has been dedicated to something else, and you want to buy it back out of that dedication. So if you have dedicated something to God and then you actually want that thing back, then you would have to buy that back to redeem it. So there's a couple things to clarify before we get into the last 3 chapters. Chapter 25, it goes over, it continues on with what Casey was talking about last week with the feasts and the festivals, and it says, and now there are 2 very important feasts and festivals that I want you to keep to continue with. So verses 1 through 14 go through the Sabbath year and the year of Jubilee. And that is, the Lord then spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai, saying, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I shall give you, then the land shall have a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its crop. But during the 7th year the land shall have a Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field nor prune your vineyard. Your harvest's aftergrowth you shall not reap, and your grapes of untrimmed vines you shall not gather. The land shall have a sabbatical year. All of you shall have the Sabbath products of the land for food, yourself and your male and female slaves and your hired man and your foreign resident, those who live as aliens with you. Even your cattle and the animals that are in your land shall have all its crops to eat. You are also to count off 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years, so that you have the time of 7 Sabbath years, namely 49 years. You shall then sound a ram's horn abroad on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of atonement you shall sound a horn all through your land. You shall thus consecrate the 50th year and proclaim a release through the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his own property, and each of you shall return to his family. You shall have the 50th year as a jubilee. You shall not sow nor reap its aftergrowth, nor gather in from its untrimmed vines, for it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You shall eat its crops out of the field. On this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his own property. If you make a sale, moreover, to your friend or buy from your friend's hand, you shall not wrong one another. Okay, lost my train of thought there. So he's saying that Israel was supposed to look different, not only in the laws that they kept or in the way that they ate or anything like that, but that they were to rely on God completely. And this was shown in the Sabbath, where you aren't supposed to do work. But then he says to go even further, to put your reliance entirely on God. Every 7th year, you need to let your land just sit and rest. That there is a Sabbath rest for all of your land. To let, as we know, later they called that rotation farming or rotational farming, because they would give parts of the land rest, because we know that land needs rest. Of course, now we have fertilizers and everything, but we are supposed to let the land rest, and Israel was supposed to let that land rest and rely on God and trust that God is going to provide for them. And then every 50th year was supposed to be even more of a test, because he said, all right, after that 7th Sabbath year, then just tack on another year of not doing anything and trust that I am going to provide for you for not only the 49th year, but also the 50th year, and also, because you haven't planted or harvested or anything, most of the 51st year too. So there were 3 years that he was saying, trust in me, because I am the one who provides for you. I am the one who gives you everything that you have. Trust that I am going to do exactly what I've said I'm going to do. And so then he even in verses 28 to 22, he comments on that very concern, where he says, but if you say, what are we going to eat on the 7th year if we do not sow or gather in our crops? Then I will say, order my blessing for you in the 6th year, that it will bring forth the crop for 3 years. When you are sowing the 8th year, you can still eat old things from the crop, eating the old until the 9th year when its crop comes in. So he understands our concerns. He says he understands that we're not just going to say, oh yeah, I'll just not eat for 3 years. That's fine. That's normal. You know, he understands where we're coming from, and he understands that our concerns are real and valid, and he says, hey, trust in me. Trust that I am going to do the things that I'm asking you to do. I'm going to make it so that you can make it through what I have asked you to do. And we see that same kind of that tone continue on through the rest of the Bible, and be something that God tells us as well, that when there is something that he is asking us to do, like talking in front of a whole bunch of people, when you know you don't want to do that, he is going to provide a way for you to be able to do what he is calling you to do. And of course, Israel didn't do that. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that they didn't once observe a Sabbath year, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but we'll keep going. All right, and then chapter 25 continues on, and it goes into how do we treat, or how is Israel supposed to treat their servants and the poor. He says he says in all of chapter 25 and in all of Leviticus, the idea that God is telling is be different. Be different than the people in the land that I'm sending you to. Be different than them. So we need to treat servants and the poor in a different way than other people would. We need to be kind to them. We need to give to them without taking interest, which seems really backward from the way we do it, right? Payday loans are like 25% interest right now, something like that. Seems a little bit different than what God was calling Israel to do, and that's in verses 35 through 43. Now, in case a countryman of yours becomes poor and his means with regard to you falter, then you are to sustain him like a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with you. Do not take usurious interest from him, but revere your God, that your countrymen will live with you. You shall not give him your silver at interest, nor your food for gain. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. If a countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to you that he sells himself to you, you shall not subject him to a slave's service. He shall be with you as a hired man, as if he were a sojourner. He shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. He shall then go out from you, he and his sons with you, and shall go back to his family, that he may return to the property of his forefathers. So that's the other thing that I didn't really talk about. In the year of Jubilee, everything was supposed to go back to the original owner. So if somebody was to sell you a piece of land, then in the year of Jubilee, that piece of land would go back to the person who sold it to you, which is a wild concept to wrap your head around. He was asking the Israelites to be so different and to understand that they don't truly own anything because everything is God's. To the point where he said, everything, even if you sell it, you get it back in the year of Jubilee. There's some things that don't, like a house in a walled city, but for the most part, things that you sell come back to you at the year of Jubilee. So he was calling Israel to be very different. And that's where, and then we get into, he was also calling them to be very different in how they kept slaves. Because commonly, what slaves and the way that we view slaves right now is something that is abused and overworked, and they are stolen from other countries, and they're forced to work in horrible conditions and all this sort of stuff. But what God had implemented in the Old Testament was he any slave that you had was something that they had to go into willingly. It was a contract between you and that person saying, you will work for me and I will treat you well, and you are getting into this willingly. So we see that in verses 44 through 46. As for your male and female slaves whom you have, you may acquire male and female slaves from the pagan nations that are around you. Then, too, it is out of the sons of the sojourners who live as aliens among you that you may gain acquisition, and out of their families who are with you, whom they will have produced in your land, they also may become your possession. You may even bequeath them to your sons after you to receive as a possession. You can use them as permanent slaves, but in respect to your countrymen, the sons of Israel, you shall not rule with severity over one another. So he's saying that slavery, he understands that slavery is something that happens, that slavery is something that is a part of that culture. But that has to be done differently than the surrounding areas would have done. You can't take one of another Israelite as a slave. He says that, and then he in Exodus 21:16 we see, he who kidnaps a man, whether he sells him or he is found in his possession, shall surely be put to death. So God, from the beginning of giving the law, he set very high standards for slave ownership. If there was anybody who was found to have somebody that was kidnapped or taken unwillingly or without their permission or anything like that, that person had a very high price to pay, their life. So the slavery was supposed to be one of those things that looked very, very different from the surrounding areas. It wasn't supposed to be abusive or imposed upon people. It was supposed to be very different. And he then, every time he brings up some sort of dealings with other people, he always adds in, remember where I took you out of. So he's always reminding people to look back and say, this is what we came out of. We can't subject other people to that sort of treatment. It says, think about that. Always remember where you were taken out of and how I treated you in that situation. And don't put other people in that sort of bondage. And then in chapter 26, we look at, so chapter 26 goes through blessings and retribution for following and not following God's law. And it's actually funny, as I was reading this, I thought, man, how many times do I think, oh, if I just knew the end, or if I knew the next step, then maybe I'd feel a little bit more comfortable with what God is calling me to do, right? If I knew what was coming next, then the call that God has made on my life would make a lot more sense. But we see in verses 32 through 35, that really didn't work for the Israelites, because he says, going to 32, I will make the land desolate, so that your enemies who settle in it will be appalled over it. You, however, I will scatter among the nations and will draw out a sword after you as your land becomes desolate and your cities become waste. Then the land will enjoy its Sabbaths all the days of the desolation while you are in your enemy's land. Then the land will rest and enjoy its Sabbaths. All the days of its desolation it will observe the rest which it did not observe on your Sabbaths while you were living on it. So we see there, Later in the Old Testament, the Israelites go into bondage in Babylon, which was, according to most estimates, roughly around 490 years after this command was given. They go into bondage, and then there's 70 years of bondage. Any math whizzes around here, that's exactly 70 Sabbath years that they missed. And then he says, okay, you aren't going to do it, so you get out. I'm going to give this land the rest that it needs. And then he gives it 70 Sabbath years, and then they get it back. But it was funny to me thinking through that, and I'm like, how many times do I think about if I knew the next step? It's like, okay, well, they knew the next step. They knew exactly what was going to happen. And then they still did it. And how convicting is it to hear a story where they knew the next step and they still didn't do it, and then God did exactly what he said he was going to do, giving the land those years of their Sabbath that they totally skipped. So in that, 27. Our commitments to God are something that God takes very seriously. So chapter 27 is, he starts out with values for different people and animals and all sorts of different things that you would dedicate to God. Now remember, dedicating to God is you have said that this thing is going to God's service, that either a person is going to God's service or there's something that you have given to God and said this is for you to use. And then and so then this section is saying, if you dedicate something to God and then you decide that you don't want that actually to be in God's service, this is how much you have to pay to get it back from that service. So he's saying that when we commit something to God, and looking at this from our perspective, if we are going to commit something to God, and we're going to make a promise and say that we're going to do something, then that matters to God. Commitments matter to God, and He places a high price, a fair price, on anything that we and the Israelites would dedicate to Him. So it's supposed to remind us that if we're going to commit something to God, taking that back after we already commit to God is going to cost us. It's going to hurt if we decide to go back on that. And then in there are a few things that we can't buy back. So there's in verses 28 through 32, it says, "Nevertheless, anything which a man sets apart to the Lord out of all that he has, of man or animal or of the fields of his own property, shall not be sold or redeemed. Anything devoted to destruction is most holy to the Lord. No one who may have been set apart among men shall be ransomed. He shall surely be put to death. Thus all the tithe of the land," that's 10%, "or the seed of the land or of the fruit of the tree is the Lord's. It is holy to the Lord. If therefore a man wishes to redeem part of his tithe, he shall add to it 1/5 of it. For every 10th part of herd or flock, whatever passes under the rod, the 10th one shall be holy to the Lord." So he's saying that there are certain things that we just can't give back. Something that is by nature dedicated to God, whether that be the firstborn of animals or the 10th of a crop or of your animals, then those things are already dedicated to God. They are by their very nature already supposed to be God's, because that's what he has put on those items. And then he goes, and this is the kicker, I believe, of Leviticus. He says in the last verse to bookend the book of Leviticus, and looking at this from our perspective, we see that this is something so weird. This idea, and it's so backward. He says, "He is not to be concerned whether it is good or bad, nor shall he exchange it. Or if he does exchange it, then both it and its substitute shall become holy. It shall not be redeemed." So now remember that holy just means set apart. So this command is saying that, hey, if you have dedicated something to God, just remember, if you would like to go and exchange that thing, you can't. All that's going to happen is if you take another animal to redeem this other animal and exchange it, all that's going to happen is now you have two animals that are dedicated to God. And you can't redeem either of them now. But looking at this from a perspective of a New Testament believer, is so powerful that he says when one animal is exchanged for another, both are counted as holy. And we see that looking at Jesus, that was exactly what he came to do for us. That he came to be like us, to be something that could be exchanged for us and count both of us as holy. That he came to give his life to exchange for ours, to make us as holy as him. Now, this isn't something that's based on our good works or our own merit. This is something that he has chosen to be the exchange for us, and that exchange has happened. And how when I think about this, the book of Leviticus, it is so powerful that the last words of Leviticus are, that's what Jesus is here to do. That is what he has done for me. There's pictures through Leviticus that are this is what Jesus is coming to do. This is the way that this is supposed to point us to Jesus. And then we look at this last verse. Or the second to last verse. The last one is just like a closing remark. But the last verse that is the laws of God, and that says that when one is exchanged for another, both are counted as holy. Just remember that as we go through our lives and we live, are we living in light of the fact that Jesus is the one who was exchanged for you to count you as holy? And he did. So what? That was the only thing I kept common with Jeff. I'm not Jeff, so what? Throughout Leviticus, we see the call that God is holy, and he is calling us to be holy. Also remembering that we are not holy, and everything that we do in our lives, every day something happens that is supposed to point us to, I am not the one who is saving me. I am not the one who can do this on my own. And we see that the purpose of Leviticus was to show us that we can't be perfect and need a Savior. That's that constant reminder of every single day. Every single day. Oh, a mouse died in my house, so I got to go take it outside because I don't want it stinking up my house. Crap, now I'm unclean. Yeah, so like it's that constant reminder of little things every single day. I am not holy. I'm not the one who can save me. I need a Savior. God is our provider. He doesn't ask us to necessarily rest every 7th year and then also rest every 50th year. But he does say that we need to rely on him. How if God was to call you to rest for an entire year and then also rest for 2 entire years, would you be able to trust that God was going to provide for you? And that's that's one of the questions of here. Our commitments to God mean something. Do they mean something to you? If you commit something to God, do you put a price on that and say, if I was to want to take this back, it's going to hurt. It's going to cost me something. Do we put that importance on what we commit to God? And then lastly, that exchange has already happened. Jesus has already paid our debt. He has already exchanged himself for you and made you to make you holy. And if you haven't accepted that exchange, if you haven't accepted that call, there will be some people sitting up in the front, and we can pray with you and talk to you about what this all is meaning. But that's the end. You like that, Dustin? All right. Well, I'll pray, and the worship team will come up, and we'll play one last song. God, I thank you. I thank you for this time, and I thank you for your word and the way that it speaks to us. I pray that as we go away from here, that you would remind us of the things that you're teaching us, that you would give us these little constant reminders that you are our provider and you are the one who saves us and sustains us. I pray that we would walk in the confidence, knowing that you will do what you've said you've done, and that our commitments to you mean something. God, I thank you for everybody here, and I pray all of this in your name. Amen.